Hello, this is Benjamin Kaplan, the Associate Director of Web Design and Development at Boston University's Center for Digital Imaging Arts. Today I'm going to continue our review of building a basic page layout with HTML and CSS by discussing how to expand our layout into a multi-column design. Let's take a look at where we left off last time. So here we are, we have a basic web wireframe in which we have a header region, a navigation region, a content section, and also a footer region. All of these regions are encapsulated inside of one div with an ID of wrapper that makes it easy for us to move the site as one unit. So let's take a look at our HTML code. Here we have our wrapper div. Inside of here we have each of the subsequent children divs, the header, navigation, content, and footer. Please also notice that I've gone ahead and made notations within my HTML code in the form of a comment to indicate where various divs are closing. For this basic example, it's not going to make a terribly large difference, but when we start making more complete and robust websites, these floating and closed div tags can be very confusing to understand. So we want to make sure we have those comments in there. So let's take a look at where we're trying to take this project today. So we're going to go ahead and add two columns inside of our content section, a column on the left and a column on the right. To do so, we want to, of course, start off by adding the physical HTML for those two block level elements. So I'm going to jump back into my HTML, come to the content section of my code, and go ahead and write in two different divs. Div ID equals something, close my div, and then specify I'm ending something here. To save myself a little bit of time, I'll copy and paste this a second time. And now I'm going to go ahead and name these divs. I'm going to call this one main_content. And then I will say that I'm ending main content. And I'll call this one sidebar. And I'll say that I'm ending sidebar. It's important when naming these divs to give them logical names. You want to avoid using names such as column left and column right, because one of the things that makes CSS an incredibly powerful tool is the ease with which we could take a column that is on the left-hand side of the page and make it show up on the right-hand side of the page. So when we're naming our divs, we want to make sure that we're giving them names that aren't specific to location, but rather specific to their purpose. If you did want to give them more generic names, it would also be okay to call them something like column 1 and column 2, seeing as these names would again be sufficiently vague such that they're not telling the specific location of these specific elements. Now let's take a look at our CSS. Remember that for this specific demonstration, we're doing our CSS internally inside of a style tag, but that for a full project, we'd want to go ahead and create an external style sheet. We have a pseudo normalizer over here, and then in a real project, we want to go ahead and make a much more robust normalizer. Okay. Taking a look at some of the code we already have here, we have our wrapper div, and inside there we have a width set, it's centered, and we've also gone ahead and given it a border. And then we have each of our various sections, the header, navigation, content, and footer. So we just went ahead a moment ago and added two divs inside of content. So I'll come to where my content rule ends and create my rules here, main_content and #sidebar. Terrific. So let's go ahead and take a look at our design again. Our design indicates that our main content div should be 550 pixels wide, while our sidebar div should be 350 pixels wide. Account for those styles inside my style sheet. Width, 550 pixels, and sidebar, width, 350 pixels. And I know that the sidebar also has a background -color of #EEE, just a very light gray color. Okay, terrific. Now again, let's take a look at our design. We know that both of these elements, both content main content and sidebar each have a width and a height specified. Now we know that both width and height are box model properties that can only be applied to block level elements. As a result, we have two block level elements that we want to line up next to one another. Anytime that we see two or more block level elements that we want to align next to one another, we should automatically start thinking about floats. So in order to address this here, we're going to go ahead and use CSS floats as the property to do so. If we take a look at this design for one more moment though, we can notice that we could go ahead and float this element to the left and this element to the right, or we could float both of them to the left. Either way would work. In this situation, just for ease of use, we're going to go ahead and float the main content div to the left and the sidebar div to the right. So let's go ahead and do that. Main content, float left, sidebar, float right. Okay. I'm now going to go ahead and preview this in my browser. I refresh, and nothing showed up. Well, that's kind of alarming. What's going on here? Well, let's go back to our code and try to conduct a test to see if, in fact, we have a semantic issue or if perhaps there's something else we're missing here. So inside of my sidebar, I'm going to go ahead and write the word test. I'll come back to my browser and refresh, and you notice that this content physically shows up in the appropriate location. The height of this, though, for some reason, does not seem to be extending down. So really the problem we have here shouldn't come as a huge surprise, because in both sidebar and main content, we have not specified a height, and we know that block level elements by default are going to assume a height of whatever the content within them need. Okay? Now we know that main content before, or the div with an ID of content, we went ahead and gave a min height to account for this issue. Now really, we don't really care about how tall content is, rather we care about how tall main content and sidebar are. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this CSS declaration out of pound content, and instead I'm going to assign it to main content and also to sidebar. Go ahead and save this, go back to my browser and refresh, and we'll notice that now we see the appropriate height of sidebar applying all the way down, but for some strange reason our footer seems to have snapped up behind both of our divs. Well, that's weird. If we return to our code, there's one more thing that we want to keep in mind whenever we're using floats, and that's the counter property. The counter property to floats is clears. So in this situation, we need to add a clearing element somewhere in our code to address this problem that we're currently seeing. The question we need to think about now is, where do we apply this element? Well, the rule of thumb when trying to clear floats is that we want our element to go somewhere after the last floating element. So both main content and sidebar are floating, so it comes somewhere after sidebar, but before the close of the parent element of the floating elements that you want to experience the height of the two floating elements. In this case, that means that we have main content is floating, so is sidebar. We would like pound content to experience the height of both main content and sidebar, so we want to go somewhere after sidebar but before content closes. And this is one of those places where it's nice to have this comment next to content. So I'll go ahead and insert a new block level element. I'll put it in a div because it's a meaningless element. And I'll give a class equal to clear. Alright, in this situation I decided to use a class because we know that ID can only be used once per page, and floating is something that happens many times within a website. So by giving this a class, I can go ahead and reuse this class multiple times to account for each of my floating issues as they arise throughout my site. So now that I have my HTML brought in, I also want to go ahead and create my CSS rule. So in my styles, I'll create a class of clear, and I'll give it the declaration of clear : both. Go ahead and save this, come back to my browser and refresh. Now we see that we have two columns, our left column and our right column. In this case is called main content and sidebar inside of our content div. Thus we've gone ahead and completed this portion of the tutorial. Again, my name is Benjamin Kaplan. I'm the Associate Director of Web Design and Development at Boston University's Center for Digital Imaging Arts. If you're interested to learn more about the topics that we cover within our curriculum, please feel free to visit us online at www.cdiabu.com.